Welcome to Analytics Nexus. Thanks for joining us for Adam Greco's presentation, Understanding Digital Analytics Data Enrichment. Adam Greco has been in the analytics industry for over 15 years. He was one of the early employees of Omniture, where he helped build the consulting practice in the US and EMEA. He also served as Director of Analytics for Salesforce.com and authored the leading book on Adobe Analytics. At Search Discovery, Adam is currently working on the Apollo product, which helps organizations improve their analytics implementations.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Greco, and I'm excited to be back at Analytics Nexus for 2020. Today's topic is understanding digital analytics data enrichment. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, as I've spent many years working with companies and seeing that they underutilize data enrichment when it comes to their analytics implementations. Before we get going, just a little bit about me. I was one of the early employees at Omniture, was in their consulting group in the US and over in Europe, and helped hundreds of companies learn more about what they can do in digital analytics, primarily with the Omniture Site Catalyst, now Adobe Analytics product. Written many blog posts on the topic and also wrote the book for Adobe on Adobe Analytics. But I've also been in the shoes of someone who runs digital analytics when I ran analytics at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and Salesforce.com. Most recently, I am a senior director at Search Discovery. So let's get on to the topic, data enrichment. Before we dive into examples of this, let's take a minute and think about what is data enrichment. So data enrichment is a topic that's been around ever since there's been data. It's generally the process of expounding upon data elements that you already have. In the digital analytics space, most of the times we capture data, it's done through JavaScript. And we basically use code to capture data into data points that are contained within a digital analytics tool like Adobe Analytics or Google Analytics or Snowplow or Heap. Now, there's a limit to how much data you can actually collect natively in some tools. And so there's cases where you may want to add more data to it. And sometimes data enrichment is known by its kind of friendly name of metadata or data on data. Whenever I say data enrichment, it's pretty synonymous with metadata, and it's basically saying we want to add more data to our data set that will help our analysts in one way or another to do better analysis. So why should you care about data enrichment, and why do I care so much about it? Well, data enrichment is something that can really help your digital analytics programs. I'm going to focus on three primary things as we go through today. The first one that I'm going to focus on is data aggregation. Many times when you collect data, you collect it at such a granular level that it's really difficult to interpret or make any sense from it. So we use data aggregation to see the data grouped together so that we could kind of get a higher level view of how that data can help us do analysis. The second area we're going to talk about is personalization. There's a lot of ways that you might want to personalize your website or the experiences that people have on your website. And one of the ways that you can do that is by augmenting data that you've collected with other data that you might have much richer data from maybe your CRM system or data warehouses. And that's a way that you can supplement what's collected in JavaScript and use it in cool ways that we'll talk about. And then underpinning both of these is the concept of segmentation. So segmentation, as hopefully you all know, is basically your way to slice and dice and group different groups of your users so that you can analyze them in different ways and see how different groups of people are using your website or maybe converting on your website. So segmentation is an underlying feature of most, if not all, digital analytics tools. And when you add metadata or you enrich your data, it just gives your analysts and your developers much more that they can segment on and cool segments that were never before possible if you're only limited to what you're collecting in JavaScript. So we'll cover all of these three areas as we get into the details here. So let's start with the first one, data aggregation. So if you've been doing anything with data in your lifetime, the odds are you're familiar with the concept of data aggregation. So here's probably the most basic example of using a spreadsheet to aggregate data. So let's imagine you work for a company and they have sales that are broken out by city or region or maybe salesperson. So if you have 20,000 rows of data, you might not be able to easily kind of in your head visualize how are we doing by city or how are we doing by region. But if you take the data and group it, normally done with a pivot table, you can see on the right here that we can easily get a sense of what's happening by region that we couldn't get by looking at thousands of rows of data. Well, this is very similar to what happens in digital analytics. If you think about it, there's many times where in digital analytics, you are capturing data at such a detailed, granular level. Here I'm showing an example of maybe external campaign tracking codes. Sometimes these come in really cryptically, like I'm showing here. And when I worked at Salesforce.com, we had over 4 million campaign codes that we were dealing with. And there was definitely no way that anyone would be able to make any sense of this at a meaningful level. But if you think about it, all of these granular campaign codes can be grouped just like a pivot table. And that's why digital analytics tools like Adobe Analytics and Google Analytics provide the ability to group detailed information into buckets, which is what we talk about when we think about data aggregation. Here you can see that I've taken all of those campaign codes and I've aggregated them to look at them by marketing channel. And now I can start to get a view of click-throughs, visits, orders, and conversion rate by marketing channel, which allows me and my digital analytics team to basically see which ones are performing best and which ones are leading to conversion. So that's how data aggregation works in the digital analytics space. But there's a benefit from a segmentation standpoint as well. I mentioned that segmentation underlies all of this. If I wanted to build a segment and look at maybe the customer journeys or paths that people took when they came from natural search, I don't want to go through thousands or millions of campaign codes and deal with it that way. But once I've aggregated them using data enrichment, I can now take my MC reporting attribute, which is really just a grouping of campaign codes, and I can segment on natural search. And so with one click of a button, I'm actually segmenting on thousands or millions of campaign codes. So, what's kind of cool about data aggregation is it's the gift that keeps on giving. First, it helps you to see the forest for the trees, but then it allows you to leverage those aggregations for segmentation as well. So, every digital analytics tool does this a little bit differently. If you're an Adobe customer, you've probably heard the term Saint classifications. If you're a Google customer, you might use dimension widening. But basically, no matter which tool you use, they ultimately allow you to map your low level data into higher level groupings. So, for example, here I can see in an Adobe world, maybe looking at my campaign codes by tactic or brand or source. And so they allow you to capture one data point natively, like campaign, but then you can basically slice and dice it or add as much metadata as you want later. Now, obviously, there's work involved in adding the metadata to your implementation, which is one of the reasons why our sponsor here, Claravine, exists, because they help you with the importation of that metadata. But one other bonus tip before we leave the data aggregation area that I wanted to talk about that a lot of people forget is that you can actually use data aggregation and metadata to save variables in your implementation. Some digital analytics tools, depending on which package you're on or how much you're paying to the vendor, will give you a certain limit of how many data points you can collect natively in JavaScript. So for example, if you're an Adobe customer, maybe you're on a package that only offers you 100 evars or dimensions. If you think about the campaign example I mentioned earlier, you might have a campaign tracking code that is passed to one of your dimensions or evars. But if you had 15 attributes that you wanted to slice and dice it by, it would be silly for you to waste 15 of your 100 dimensions on one particular use case like campaign tracking. And so if you had 15 attributes plus the actual campaign code itself, that could be 16 evars or 16 dimensions out of your 100 that you're using. But if you use metadata or data enrichment, those 15 items become attributes of just one dimension, which means that you can save a ton of variables and potentially money if you're thinking about upgrading to a more expensive package with your vendor. So keep in mind this bonus tip that not only does data enrichment allow you to aggregate the data, but it also allows you to save variables at the same time. So now let's switch gears and talk about the other benefit of data enrichment, which is personalization. So over the last couple of years, what we've seen is that there's been a growing trend that customers want to have better digital experiences when they visit websites or they use mobile apps. I attribute a lot of this personally to companies like Amazon and Netflix, who really went crazy with personalization. And even though they have millions of customers, they found a way to make you feel like they actually know a lot about you and they know what you want, maybe video recommendations or TV shows. So users have kind of gotten spoiled over the last couple of years, and they've wanted and demanded more personalized experiences. They want to feel like you know them and that you're treating them differently than all of your other customers. But this becomes tricky because data privacy laws, things like GDPR and cookie deletion, every year it gets more and more challenging to actually know who these people are on your website. So how can you personalize in a world where you really aren't supposed to know that much about people? Well, the thing you don't want to do is capture PII. It'd be easy to do. Sure enough, you can just do what someone did here. One of my clients, which I highly discourage and is illegal in areas like Europe and California, is actually capturing PII, capturing an email address. That's kind of a no-no nowadays. So you should never have been doing this, but if you were doing this in the past, you should probably stop doing this now. But there are still ways that you could use data enrichment to personalize. And a lot of my customers, they do this through authentication. Many websites or apps have user IDs where people create an account. And you can, encrypt, you can hash, do anything that your lawyers need you to do to make sure that you're compliant with privacy laws. But at the end of the day, you can have some sort of a data point that is not personally identifiable, that knows who these people are, really just so that it's a conduit or a primary key to your backend systems like your CRM system or your data warehouse. So why would you want to do this? Well, in Adobe Analytics or Google Analytics, you're generally not going to have certain attributes that you're going to have in your backend systems. For example, in your backend, you might know the actual first date that someone became a customer. You might know their birth year. You might know their gender. You might know what was the first product that they ever purchased. What was the first campaign that brought them to us way back when? Maybe it was years ago. As you know, digital analytics tools and JavaScript and cookies are very transient. You can collect birth year today if you want to, but it's going to probably be gone in the future when people switch computers or delete cookies. So by using the backend data, that is going to persist. But you can then supplement your user ID, which you can capture every time they log in your analytics tool, and then you can supplement that or augment that with the data from your backend. So this is a really cool way that you can personalize, because if you think about it, if you know their user ID, you can't really personalize on, say, like their age, or like maybe you wanted to run a campaign on your site to baby boomers. Well, if you only know their age, you can't do that. But if you can leverage your backend to import, say, their birth year tied to the user ID, then you can do different things. You might want to, show an A/B test for maybe baby boomers versus Gen X, or maybe you want to show different content to people who are, of a certain generation. Or maybe one of the attributes you upload is that they're a gold customer versus a bronze customer. And maybe for gold customers, you want to offer chat or something, higher level of support. However, even if you had, let's say, birth year and you wanted to personalize based on whether they were a baby boomer, if you think about it, if you wanted to build a segment in your analytics tool, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to build a segment that is going in and looking at all of the different years that could make them a baby boomer. That would be really time consuming. But if we think about the aggregation we talked about earlier, if we actually grouped these years and grouped them into a new metadata attribute called generation, which is pivoted off of birth year, then we don't have to do this on the right. We can just create a segment off of the metadata attribute generation where it equals baby boomer. So the cool part is that you could save time and not have to build these crazy segments. You could leverage the metadata you've already done. And this is a little crazy because we're actually doing metadata on metadata. If you think about it, birth year is a metadata attribute of user ID, and then generation is a metadata attribute off birth year. And that's fine, totally plausible, can save you time and work. Now, there's one other thing that this leads me to, which is a little deeper, a little more complex, but I want to talk about it because I think it's important and a lot of people don't think about it. And it's called dynamic data enrichment. And that's just a term I've made up. I don't think it's an industry term. But let me explain why this is so important. And this is a huge mistake that I see companies make when it comes to metadata. So if you think about metadata, it's always retroactive. It's just retroactive by nature. So if you upload a metadata attribute, it's going to always replace any other metadata for that same item that it's ever seen in the past. And this can be confusing, so let's look at it through an example. Let's imagine that you had maybe 100 campaign tracking codes, and someone uploaded a metadata attribute of marketing channel. And they said these 100 campaign codes are paid search. But maybe someone screwed up and that was wrong. And they say, you know what, actually, those were from a Twitter campaign, so it should be under social. So that's fine. You could now take those same 100 detailed codes and upload new metadata and say, you know what, these actually are social. Well, now it will retroactively change those 100 codes. So if anyone looks at any reports, either from now or in the past, basically it's always going to look like those campaign codes were social because it's overwriting the paid search with social. That's a good thing. That's really awesome. That means that if you mess up, you can fix it later. The other cool part about the retroactive nature of metadata is it means you don't have to pass all the data that you need right when a campaign starts. In this situation, maybe you don't have all of the metadata that you need for the campaign codes, but you do have the campaign code. That means you could launch the campaign today and know that you can upload its marketing channel 2 weeks from now, and it will ultimately show everyone for any data time frame that it was part of paid search or social. So in many respects, the fact that metadata or data enrichment is retroactive is awesome. It really helps you save time and fix data. But there's a downside that people don't think about. So the downside is that there's certain data attributes that you don't want to be retroactive. Because if you make them retroactive, it's actually going to make your data wrong. So this is hard to explain, but let me go through an example because I think this makes it a little clearer. Let's imagine that, as I mentioned earlier, you have in JavaScript a dimension user ID, and customer A is user ID 12345. Now you've used the cool metadata personalization things I talked about earlier to upload a metadata attribute of customer lifetime value. And you know from your backend system that user ID 12345 at this point in time today has a customer lifetime value of $5,000. So you upload that, and that's great. You can look at reports by how much money people have spent. You could look at journeys for people who've maybe had a lifetime value of 5,000 and under, or 5,000 to 7,000, whatever you want. However, if that person hits your website and that same user 12345 purchases $2,000 of goods today, then maybe a day from now or 2 days from now, depending on how fast you update your metadata, they're going to have a new customer lifetime value of $7,000, which is great. You want to have it updated, the latest and greatest data. However, because of the retroactive nature, you're going to see that that person always had a lifetime value of $7,000. So even if you look maybe 2 years ago, if you're doing year over year data, you can see that that person had a lifetime value of $7,000, and that's not actually true. A year ago, they may have only had a lifetime value of 2,000 or 3,000 or 5,000, but now it looks like they've always had a lifetime value of $7,000. And it's not just this example. This problem applies to any data point that can change over time. If you think about it, capturing something like age as a metadata attribute, if you take user ID and you upload age, that's kind of silly because every year someone's going to get older. Someone who has a marital status of single could be married 2 years from now. And so you might be looking at behavior of paths of people who are single, and then you actually don't realize it, but you're looking at people who are married in single and vice versa. You might look at what products they've purchased as an attribute and say, okay, they've bought product A and B, but then next week, if they buy C and D and they upload it, it's going to always look like they've bought A, B, C, and D. And things like city, state, zip, country, if people move across the country, you can get yourself in real trouble. So if you think about any data point that could change over time, that is a terrible thing for you to upload as metadata because you're just going to get yourself in trouble. But this concept that I talk about called dynamic data enrichment can fix this. What dynamic data enrichment is basically taking that metadata and uploading it in real time to your analytics tool and putting it natively into a data point instead of relying on an attribute. So how this would work is a visitor would come to your site, they would authenticate, we would know that their user ID, say 12345, then we would do a real-time lookup and then grab the current customer lifetime value or age or marital status, and then we would grab that data and insert it into an actual native data point, like an EVAR or a dimension. And now that data would be locked in forever. There's no way it's going to change. Now, digital analytics vendors have ways that you can do this where you can pay them to upload your metadata to them, and then they will in real time insert this data into native attributes. Or you can find ways to do this on your own. But by using dynamic data enrichment, you're guaranteeing that you're taking the metadata that you want, but you're getting it in real time and making sure that it's locked in. An example of this is I worked with a financial services client, and they had an authenticated user ID, and some of the attributes that they were uploading were, is this person retired or not? Are they an active trader? Are they a high net worth customer? And they were doing this with good old fashioned attributes and metadata. The problem is that customers were, being classified as retired, and then, some people who weren't retired, then they became retired. That was messing up their data. Some people were active traders at one point, but then they stopped being active traders. And same thing with high net worth. So what we did is we used dynamic data enrichment to get the current retirement status, the current active trader status, and the current high net worth status at the time they were on the website right now, and then dynamically insert that in, and then all of their data was good, and then they can build cool reports like this and look at overlaps and build segments. So that's why data enrichment, you got to be careful about whether the data point that you're enriching is one that will change over time and won't. So you can make sure you're taking advantage or avoiding the retroactive nature. So let's go through a couple examples of data enrichment. I always like to show practical real-world use cases of what we're talking about. So the most popular example of data enrichment is external campaigns. This is probably the one that everyone uses when they first learn about data enrichment. As we mentioned earlier, you might have thousands or millions of campaign codes, and you want to slice and dice those by different campaign descriptions or sources or mediums and so on. So when you do that, you end up being able to see things like visits by marketing channel, Or if you're a financial customer, maybe you want to look at product application starts, completes, and completion rate by marketing channel, or you want to look at it by the various different campaigns or maybe campaign owner. So campaigns is a very popular way that people learn about data enrichment. However, I'm always bummed out when I look at new implementations of analytics and I see that this is the only way that they're using metadata. There are so many other ways that you could take advantage of metadata. Another one that I use a lot is product data enrichment. Most websites sell products. Even if you don't sell something, if you maybe are a content site, you can think of your different content items or articles as your product. And so you generally have some sort of unique ID for your product or your SKUs. Well, those IDs don't really tell your users much about what's going on with your products. And you might have a whole product catalog like, hey, I know the category it's in, I know the subcategory, I know who owns this product. Each product or SKU might have a different color or size. You might have a website where you sell multiple brands from different manufacturers and you want to know, hey, this ID is actually, Sony, and this one is Microsoft. So all of these are valid metadata attributes. And because most of these aren't going to change over time, you can upload this and not have to worry about it being dynamic. You can just upload it just like we talked about earlier. And if you get it wrong, you could use the retroactive nature to update it. So now you can have an unlimited number of attributes about your products, which means that your digital analytics team can now slice and dice by division or product owner, maybe look at paths of products by different sizes or colors. And then one example is building segments off of your metadata. So here, imagine I have products and one of the attributes I have is size. And for some crazy reason, someone wants to do an analysis where they say, we want to see cart abandonment, but only where products were of a large size. So here we could see building a segment in Adobe Analytics where we're looking for a cart addition taking place, but we're excluding people who ordered, but we want to have the cart addition be for a product where the size of the product was large. And we could do a similar one, just duplicate that for medium and duplicate that for small. We could do the same thing for different colors, different brands, and so on. So what's really cool is that these attributes can be used in multiple ways. When I worked at Salesforce.com, one of the other ways that we used data enrichment was internal campaigns. So let's imagine you have a page where you've got a lot of call to actions. Well, each of these different call to actions can be given a unique ID, a campaign code, if you will. But these aren't external campaigns, they're internal campaigns. And so we can look at a granular level how each was impressed, clicked, the click-through rate. But in addition, we can add metadata here to look at maybe the creative of each of those, or what version was it. We can even look at the location. Was it in the hero spot? Was it in the top banner? And think of that as an attribute. How big was the internal campaign? Was it a small size, big size? Was it a button? Was it a hero image? Was it a text link? Or we could think about what was the reason or strategy behind that internal campaign code being there. Was it a cross sell? Was it there because some executive made us put it there? Was it there because of an A/B test? Or maybe you're using some sort of kind of cool machine learning algorithms and you want to document that these are algorithmically placed, or maybe even which algorithm is doing it. So you would have all these different metadata attributes of your internal campaign code, which means instead of looking at a boring report like this, where you're just looking at, code 1, code 2, code 3, where you could see orders, revenue, and conversion, you can now see this same report for all of those attributes that we just talked about. Slice and dice it any way that you want. But too often I see this is the report that people are using, and they're not taking advantage of all of this wonderful metadata that is at their disposal. Another thing that I think you should think about doing with metadata is being creative with it. There's lots of data points that you have that you can really think outside of the box and think of cool ways you can do it. And I'll show you one example that I did in the past. When I was working with consulting, I would oftentimes write blog posts and drive people to my website. And one of the reasons I did that is because I was using a tool called Demandbase. And there's lots of tools like this, Demandbase, Kickfire, ABM tools that allow you to look at the IP address of the company hitting your site and see if they can figure out what company they work for. So here at the top left, I'm showing a couple companies who are reading my blog. Well, I also had companies that were competitors, more often than you would think, reading my blog posts, other consulting firms. And so I would see what companies they were from. And obviously, I didn't think they were going to buy my consulting services. So I applied metadata to the demand based company here, and I flagged whether they were a competitor, yes or no. This allowed me to then build segments so that when I was looking at companies that I wanted to maybe uh, call on to get business, I don't think I want to call on my competitors. So I could make a segment that says, I want to exclude any competitors. So now this is an easy way for me to strip out all of the competitors by using metadata. And it took me, a couple minutes to go in, maybe once a month and look if there's any new competitors who hit my blog, flag them with metadata, and now all their data is taken out. So I encourage you to look at every data point that you have in your implementation and think about, is there other data that I have at the organization of my company that I could add to that data that would expand my analytics capabilities? So last thing I want to talk about is the actual importation of metadata. So data enrichment imports take time and effort, and a lot of times it can be painful. So if you think about it, if you have millions of codes, well, someone has to upload millions of rows of metadata. So traditionally, this has been done through digital analytics tools through a spreadsheet or a CSV file or FTP. And you go into your analytics tool. Here I'm showing how it works with Adobe, where you basically choose to import, and then you say, here's the file where I have all my metadata, overwrite the data when I give it to you, and you let it go. But maintaining that can be quite difficult. And there's a reason why spreadsheets aren't great. Is first of all, sometimes you can have conflicts if you have different people who want to get into the spreadsheet at the same time. This has gotten a little better over the years with Microsoft Office going online and Google Sheets, but it still can be a little tricky when you've got lots of people in there making different changes. The other thing that's complicated is sometimes you want to have rule validation where you make sure that people are using the right terms for your metadata. So for example, LinkedIn as one word instead of LinkedIn as two words. So you want to make sure that if you are using a spreadsheet, you're building some validation to make sure that it's not screwing up the reports you later see in your analytics tools. But over the years, people have gotten tired of kind of dealing with this the old fashioned way. And that's why companies like Claravine have come around to build tools that will help make this process much easier. Still kind of looks like a spreadsheet, but now you can have much more granular data validation and rules and have many people come in at one time and be able to kind of coordinate with each other and make sure that the metadata is as good as it can be. And the cool part about this is not only can the data be validated, but instead of you having to go back into the tools and manually upload this, you can use the latest API technologies to push a button and have this data automatically sent to your digital analytics vendor. So this has been an area of big improvement for analytics tools. And the other thing is that data enrichment, if you think about it, tools like Claravine can take metadata that you give it, but they can also automatically tap into sources of your metadata, like going out to like salesforce.com or your data warehouse internally. And instead of you having to manually enter all of this metadata, which stinks if you've got hundreds of thousands or millions of rows, you can programmatically grab it from other sources and make sure that you're getting the right data and save yourself time. No one wants to spend time uploading metadata. So that's what I really wanted to cover. If we kind of think of this all together as we summarize, data enrichment is a critical piece of digital analytics. If you're only looking at the data that you're capturing in JavaScript, then you're missing out on a lot of cool data that you can be taking advantage of. Through aggregation, we saw that you can group the granular data you have into a higher level so you can really see the benefits of it and see the forest for the trees and make the data more actionable. And in some cases, you can even save data points and not have to worry about running out of variables in your analytics vendor. We also saw that you have great data in your CRM systems or data warehouses that you can import through data enrichment to better personalize your visitor experiences and have better segments and have better ways to see how different groups of people are navigating your site. So segmentation is a huge feature of digital analytics tools, and the more data you can feed it, the better your segments can be. The more granular you have your data and the more attributes that you can pull in from any data source that you have means that your digital analysts can slice and dice data in different ways and build really cool segments. But if you don't want to deal with the pain and suffering of uploading all of this metadata, you can take advantage of the latest technologies out there to do this through APIs and not have to manually import this metadata. So if this was a topic that is of interest to you and you want to learn a little more, I've written an ebook for the folks at Claravine, a 21-page document that covers a lot of these topics but goes into more depth with more examples. So it's a free ebook that you can get. I put a URL link here, and if you want, there's a QR code that you can point your camera at, and it will take you right to the form where you can fill out and get this free ebook. So I hope this session was helpful for you to kind of dive deep into data enrichment. And I really challenge you to think about how you could use more attributes, more data in your implementation to do cool things. If you have any questions or want to follow up, my email address is here. And I've put a QR code that you can point your camera at and go right to my LinkedIn page. And I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn with anyone and answer any questions there. So thank you so much for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your sessions at Analytics Nexus.
Thanks so much for watching this presentation. Join us on the Analytics Nexus Slack to talk with our presenters about this topic and more.